Should biological men be able to compete in women's athletics? That's a question that seems to be growing with even more ferocity as people continue to debate this. And I want to hear from you at 217-629-7970. And is there a way to have this debate civilly rather than having people shout out and shout down and act in somewhat violent manner towards those who they may have a different opinion with? We saw this play out last week in California with Riley Gaines, a collegiate swimmer who's speaking out on women's rights issues as she sees it, to a very vocal crowd saying trans women are women, but should they be allowed to compete in women's athletics? And even this issue coming up with questions about Title IX and the Biden administration looking to change Title IX. If you're not familiar with Title IX, it's a measure that ultimately was supposed to bring equity to women's athletics, to allow for women to have the same types of access to scholarships as men have, to allow for public resources to be utilized in an equal fashion to promote and help women's athletics utilize spaces just as men's athletics is. So now they're looking to possibly change Title IX to allow for not just women to have that, but also those who might identify as women. So not just biological women, but even biological men who identify as women. The Biden administration seeming to want to open that up. This is all coming because last week Riley Gaines claims to have been assaulted. And headline here, former NCAA swimmer Riley Gaines refutes university statement that trans activists peacefully protested. Here is a news report from last week that highlights what happened to Riley Gaines while she was speaking at an event on that campus in San Francisco.
Our lead college swimmer says that she was ambushed and physically hit by trans rights protesters after speaking at San Francisco State University. Riley Gaines posted video on Twitter last night saying she was confronted by a trans rights activist. Gaines is a former competitor of controversial trans swimmer Leah Thomas. Gaines says police escorted her to safety and that she was forced to barricade for 3 hours in a classroom. The university says police did not make any arrests, but that it is conducting an investigation. The attack happened after Gaines spoke last night to students at a Turning Point USA event at SF State. She says she is not against transgender athletes competing, but believes they have an unfair advantage in women's athletics, and there should be more dialogue about how to make athletics more inclusive.
So again, Riley Gaines getting some protesters even claiming that she was physically assaulted. She was on Tucker Carlson on Friday talking more about this, how she had to wait for armed police to show up to escort her out of the building because she was barricaded in for 3 hours by these protesters who were essentially then demanding that Gaines pay to be able to peacefully leave the premise. And here she is responding to some of that on Tucker Carlson on Friday nights.
Because they were terrified. They were scared to put their hands on these people because they know what these people are capable of. These people yelled obscene, violent, vulgar things to both myself and the officers. And the officers, I could tell, didn't feel comfortable putting them in a position that would mean they do their job, which is a really scary, chilling thought.
This is the most dangerous extremist movement in the United States right now. It's getting bigger, not smaller. It's gaining steam, not losing it. The White House has endorsed it. I mean, what does this mean for you? And I just can't say it again since I happen to know you. You are an inherently moderate person who means harm to no one. But are you worried about your safety going forward?
You know, I am worried about my safety. I have to be now. When we have people who are willing to do this, and we know why they're willing to do this, it's because they don't have reason, they don't have logic, they don't have science, they don't have common sense on their side. That's on my side. And so they protrude by violence, whether it's physical or verbal violence. But what this means for me, this does not deter me. This assures me that I am doing the right thing. This will not silence me when they want me to be silenced. It just means I need to speak louder.
Is there a way to have this debate without it erupting into violence screaming matches and threats of violence? Is there a way to logically have debates about this? And too often I think we find this is the case where one side gets overly emotional and they just won't let you even get your side out in a civil manner. They'll shout you down. They'll disparage you. They'll label you a bigot or a racist or a transphobe or whatever the case may be, when really it comes down to the question of ultimate fairness and a level playing field in athletics. And should biological men who have gone through puberty with denser muscles, with longer bones, with more testosterone, should they be allowed to go into a ring with a person born a woman? And when you have these debates, how can you keep it from turning into a pitch of violent rhetoric? It's kind of alarming to see this play out, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Good morning, Greg. Yeah, it's common sense. I feel like when other states are, saying, hey, you're not allowed to play sports, you play in your biological sport, you're born a boy, you're going to play boy sports. No one's like, wow, that sounds crazy. No, everybody goes, well, yeah. What? Who said otherwise? It's not really a controversial issue, except for a small, very loud voice on Twitter, and this is where I fault the media. They're taking a story from Twitter and then pretending it's news when it's not. It's much smaller than that. But you know how that goes. You expand on it, and it seems like it's much larger. Who's in the Biden administration saying this sounds like a good side to be on?
The spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, essentially spelling out that, they side with the trans community on these issues.
It's ridiculous. South Park called it again. Everybody take a look, YouTube, South Park, Strong Woman. Thanks, Greg.
That's a fantastic episode. I appreciate the call. And if people aren't familiar with that South Park episode, essentially there's a teacher at South Park who's very strong, independent woman, very liberal woman. She is in athletics, and she goes and starts competing, but then the competition she's a part of, they allow for a person born a man who looks like Muscle Man Randy Savage, then compete with the other women in this, and he just trounces them all over the place. Just trounces them. I don't want to spoil it, but you can go watch that episode yourself. South Park is regularly showing itself to be the tip of the spear when it comes to social commentary, being able to sit on the fence and throw stuff at both sides. 217-629-7970. But listen, I think that the previous caller is downplaying this a bit. I don't think that this is just a small minority of people with loud voices, or that this is just an isolated incident. This is happening across the country, where you've got this debate happening, not just about women's athletics, but also about the health of youth and whether or not minors should be able to have hormone therapy, or whether or not minors should be able to have gender reassignment surgery, which can be life-altering, which can sterilize a child, which can bring about mental issues down the road, and just a lifelong of constant surgeries to have to deal with their body either rejecting or not taking a certain surgery properly. So there's all kinds of different issues that are being raised here across the country, and the idea of gender ideology, and whether or not people are being kind of, encouraged to have gender dysphoria, which is a psychological issue, and it's an issue that requires psychological attention. But are we having this gender ideology in schools essentially have a social contagion of making young people think that they're uncomfortable in their body? And everybody feels that when they're going through puberty. Raise your hand if you felt just fine going through puberty. Nobody's going to raise their hand. But when you have that sentiment, and then you have a teacher somewhere say, hey, here's gender ideology, you might just be, a transgender person. And then they ultimately are encouraged to proclaim a certain pronoun, and then they get lumped in. This is not something that's going on in very small little niche places. This is happening across the country. Your thoughts? Good morning.
Good morning. One thing I want to, in your statement when you're talking about trans women competing, you said that they had gone through puberty as a male, and then they transition. I think there's a difference between that situation and a situation where a child has not gone through puberty, started hormone therapy, and basically never reached that level through puberty of being a male. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so pre-puberty taking hormone blockers or something like that.
Correct. I think that trans girl is different than a trans woman who went through puberty as a male and then is competing.
No, and I absolutely understand that argument, but that gets us to a totally different issue of whether or not minors should have access to that type of medical option.
I agree. And to me, that is between a parent and their medical provider. That is not for the government to say what you can do.
Sure. Yeah, and listen, there's an argument for that, and we can have that debate at another day. I appreciate you calling in and sharing those sentiments. One more call. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Hey, I just want to say I'm liberal, and I do not believe that transgender women should compete with women. Their bodies are different.
What about the previous caller, though, that said, hey, if they have puberty blockers before they go into puberty, should biological men be able to compete with women?
No. And here's the thing. You have different races for each gender. Have another set of races for the transgenders. They can compete against themselves. Just like the women compete against themselves and the men compete against themselves. You know?
Or you could have a totally different no-holds-barred, circuit where it's whoever wants to get into the ring, get into the ring. It doesn't matter your weight. It doesn't matter your gender. Here's a weapon.
You have the NBA and the WNBA. You don't see them competing against each other.
Women's soccer and men's soccer and so on. Listen, I think that this is a debate that's going to go on and on and on, no question, and we may have it here from time to time. Appreciate everybody chiming in here at 217-629-7979.